Karen Miller was tired. Her eyes felt heavy as she drove her blue sedan down the empty street. It was almost midnight, and rain fell in a steady pattern against her windshield. The wipers moved back and forth, clearing her view for just seconds, before the rain covered the glass again. Karen worked as an intelligence analyst for the government. Not that many people knew exactly what she did. When asked, she would smile politely and say she processed information for a federal agency. Tonight she had stayed late at the office in Virginia, finishing reports that couldn't wait until morning. She yawned and adjusted her position in the driver's seat. Home was just 15 minutes away. A hot shower and her comfortable bed were all she could think about. Karen didn't notice when her car drifted slightly over the yellow line in the middle of the road, but Officer Frank Davis noticed. He sat in his police cruiser in a dark parking lot, watching for traffic violations. Frank had been a cop for 15 years in this small Virginia town. He prided himself on having a sixth sense about drivers who were breaking the law. "Got one," he muttered to himself as he spotted Karen's car cross the line. He turned on his engine and pulled onto the road. With a quick movement, he activated the flashing blue and red lights on top of his vehicle. Karen jumped slightly when she saw the lights in her rearview mirror. She checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. With a sigh, she put on her turn signal and pulled to the side of the road. The rain seemed to fall harder now as she waited for the officer to approach. Officer Davis took his time. He sat in his car for a full minute, entering Karen's license plate number into his computer system. Nothing unusual came up, just a normal car owned by a normal citizen. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the rain. Karen rolled down her window as the officer approached. Cold raindrops blew in, making her shiver. "License and registration," Officer Davis said. His tone was flat. He shined his flashlight directly into Karen's face, making her squint and turn away. "Of course, officer," Karen said. She reached for her purse on the passenger seat and began searching for her wallet. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Officer Davis watched her with narrowed eyes. "You were swerving. Crossed the center line back there." Karen found her license and pulled it out. "I'm sorry about that. I've been working late and I'm very tired. I should have been more careful." "Working late, huh?" Officer Davis repeated, with a slight smirk. "Sure, I hear that one all the time." Karen handed him her license and then opened the glove compartment to find her registration. "I'm an analyst for the government. We had a deadline tonight." Officer Davis took the documents and looked them over. His flashlight beam bounced from the papers to Karen's face and back again. "Government analyst, right?" His tone made it clear he didn't believe her or didn't care. "I'll be right back," he said, walking back to his patrol car. Karen sat in her car, rain drumming on the roof. She checked the time on her dashboard clock. 11:48 p.m. She just wanted to get home. In his cruiser, Officer Davis ran Karen's license. Through the system. Karen Miller, age 35. One speeding ticket from 3 years ago, but otherwise a clean record. Nothing that would make this stop interesting or worthwhile for him. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking. It had been a slow night. The department had been pushing for more DUI arrests this month. The police chief had mentioned it specifically at their last meeting. More arrests meant more fines for the town. More fines meant budget increases. Officer Davis looked at Karen through his windshield. She was just sitting there, waiting patiently. A normal traffic stop would end with a warning or maybe a small ticket, but Frank Davis wasn't interested in normal tonight. He got out of his car and walked back to Karen's window. "Ms. Miller, have you had anything to drink tonight?" he asked suddenly. Karen looked up at him in surprise. "What? No, absolutely not. I don't drink when I have to drive." Officer Davis leaned closer to her open window and made a show of sniffing the air. "I think I smell alcohol. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "There must be some mistake," Karen said, genuinely confused. "I haven't had anything to drink. I've been at work all evening." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Officer Davis repeated, his voice hardening. "This isn't a request." Karen felt a flutter of panic in her chest. This was absurd. She hadn't been drinking, but arguing with a police officer seemed unwise. Slowly, She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened her car door. The rain immediately soaked into her blouse as she stepped out onto the wet road. Her work shoes, not meant for standing in puddles, quickly became saturated. "Over here," Officer Davis instructed, pointing to a flat section of the shoulder. "I'm going to conduct a field sobriety test." "This really isn't necessary," Karen said, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable. "I haven't had anything to drink." "That's what all the entitled white ladies say," Officer Davis commented with a smirk. "You all think you're above the law, don't you?" Karen stared at him, stunned by the comment. She had never considered herself entitled, and she certainly didn't think she was above the law. "Officer, touch your nose with your right finger, then your left," he interrupted. "Then stand on one foot and count to 30. Standing in the rain, Karen tried to follow his instructions. The water dripped into her eyes, and her wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin. She touched her nose as directed, and then balanced on one foot. She made it to 28 before her wet shoe slipped slightly on the pavement. "Aha," Officer Davis said, as if he'd caught her in a lie. "Loss of balance, classic sign of intoxication." "It's raining," Karen pointed out, frustration creeping into her voice. "The ground is wet. Anyone would slip. Walk in a straight line. Heel to toe," Officer Davis continued, ignoring her comment. 9 steps forward, turn, 9 steps back." Karen did as she was told, walking carefully on the slick pavement. The rain had plastered her hair to her head now. She was completely soaked and getting angry. "Officer, this is ridiculous. I'm standing in a downpour doing balance tests. I haven't been drinking." "Your speech sounds slurred to me," Officer Davis said, though Karen had spoken perfectly clearly. "And you're being uncooperative." "I'm not being uncooperative," Karen protested. "I'm just—" "Turn around," Officer Davis ordered suddenly. "Hands behind your back." "What?" Karen couldn't believe what was happening. "Why?" "You're under arrest for driving under the influence," Officer Davis stated flatly. "Turn around now." "This is insane." "I demand a breathalyzer test," Karen said, her voice rising. "Oh, you'll get one down at the station," Officer Davis said with a small smile. "Now turn around or I'll add resisting arrest." Shocked and furious, Karen turned around. The cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists. Officer Davis gripped her arm and led her to his patrol car. "My car," Karen began. "Will be towed," Officer Davis finished for her. Standard procedure. He helped her into the back seat of his cruiser and closed the door. Karen sat there, dripping wet and handcuffed, as Officer Davis called for a tow truck. Through the partition, she could hear him speaking to the dispatcher. "Yeah, got another one. DUI. Need Jerry's towing at the corner of Maple and 5th. There was a pause. "Yeah, lady claims she works for the government." He laughed. "Don't they all have some kind of excuse?" At the police station, Karen was processed like a common criminal. Her photograph was taken. Her fingerprints were recorded. She was given a breathalyzer test, which showed her blood alcohol content at 0.01, far below the legal limit of 0.08. Officer Davis frowned at the reading but didn't release her. "Machine must be acting up," he muttered. "We'll do a blood test to confirm." Karen was placed in a holding cell to wait. She watched as Officer Davis chatted and laughed with other officers at their desks. She heard him say, "Another entitled princess who thinks the rules don't apply to her." Sitting on the hard bench in her damp clothes, Karen felt a cold anger building inside her. In her daily work, she handled information that protected national security. She had passed rigorous background checks. She had security clearances that Officer Frank Davis couldn't even imagine. Yet here she was, falsely arrested and humiliated by a cop who had decided to target her for no reason. As the night dragged on, Karen began to think about the resources at her disposal. Resources that, until now, she had never considered using for personal reasons. If Officer Davis wanted to play games, he had chosen the wrong woman to mess with. Karen Miller might look like an ordinary government employee, but she was far from ordinary. And soon everyone in this small-town police station would understand exactly who they were dealing with. Karen Miller was released from the police station at 6 in the morning. Her clothes were still damp. and she felt stiff from sitting on the hard bench all night. The blood test had shown no alcohol in her system, but Officer Davis had still processed the DUI charge. She was given a court date 4 weeks away and told she could leave. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. Karen called a taxi since her car had been towed to the police impound lot. As she waited on the curb, she watched police officers arriving for the morning shift. They walked past her without a glance, as if she were invisible. The taxi dropped. Karen at her small house in a quiet neighborhood. Her neighbor Betty Walsh was outside collecting her newspaper. Usually, Betty would wave and smile. Today, she looked at Karen's rumpled clothes and quickly turned away, hurrying back into her house. Karen felt a stab of shame even though she had done nothing wrong. Inside her house, Karen took a long, hot shower. She called her supervisor at work and explained she would be late. She didn't mention the arrest. That was a conversation she wasn't ready to have. 3 days later, Karen found her name in the local newspaper's police blotter section. Karen Miller, 35, arrested for driving under the influence, it read. Just a simple line, but enough to make her stomach twist with anxiety. Anyone who read the paper would see it. Anyone could jump to conclusions. The following Monday, Karen's supervisor, Greg Scott, called her into his office. He was a thin man with glasses who never raised his voice. Today his face was serious as he closed the door behind her. "Karen, we need to talk," he said, pointing to a chair across from his desk. "Something has come to my attention." Karen sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew what was coming. "There's a report of you being arrested for DUI last week," Greg said. His voice was quiet but firm. "You know we have strict security protocols here. Any legal issues must be reported immediately." "I was going to tell you," Karen said. "But it's not what it seems. I wasn't drinking. The breathalyzer and blood test both showed that. The officer made a mistake." Greg looked at her for a long moment. "I hope that's true, Karen. You're one of our best analysts. But until this is resolved, I'm going to have to limit your access to sensitive materials. It's protocol." Karen felt like she had been punched. Her job was everything to her. "But I'm innocent," she said. "The court will see that." "For your sake." "I hope so," Greg replied. "But until then, my hands are tied." That afternoon, Karen called the public defender's office. She was assigned an attorney named Joe Phillips. They arranged to meet the next day at his office. Joe's office was small and cluttered with papers. He was a young man who looked tired. Dark circles hung under his eyes and his tie was loose around his neck. He glanced at Karen's file for only a few seconds before speaking. "Standard DUI case," he said, flipping through the pages. "First offense, we can probably get you a plea deal. Maybe reduced to reckless driving, some community service, a fine." "I don't want a plea deal," Karen said firmly. "I wasn't drinking. The test proved it. I want to fight this." Joe looked up, surprise crossing his face. "Fight it? Against Officer Davis's testimony? That's not a good idea." "Why not?" "The evidence supports me," Karen insisted. Joe leaned back in his chair. "Look, Ms. Miller, Frank Davis has been on the force for 15 years. He has a perfect record in court. Judge Benson always takes his word over defendants. And the dashboard camera footage from that night is apparently corrupted." "Corrupted?" Karen repeated. "That's convenient." "These things happen," Joe said with a shrug. "Technical glitches, and without that footage, it's your word against his." "What about his body camera?" Karen asked. "Department policy says they don't have to release that for cases like this," Joe explained. "I already tried." Karen couldn't believe what she was hearing. So an officer can just arrest someone without cause, claim they were drunk despite test, results showing otherwise, and there's nothing we can do? Joe spread his hands. "Welcome to the justice system. It's not perfect." Over the next 3 weeks, Karen tried to prepare for her court date. She met with Joe twice more, but each meeting left her more frustrated. He seemed more interested in getting her to accept a plea deal than in building a defense. At work, Karen was given basic tasks far below her skill level. Her coworkers whispered when she walked by. She felt herself growing more isolated each day. Her neighbor Betty still avoided her. One evening, Karen heard Betty talking to another neighbor. "I always thought she was so normal," Betty said. "But you never really know people, do you? Driving drunk? She could have killed someone." The day before her court appearance, Karen received a call from the prosecutor's office. A woman named Linda Hoffman introduced herself. "Ms. Miller, I'm calling to discuss your case," Linda said. Her voice was businesslike and cold. "We're willing to offer you a deal. Plead guilty to reckless driving, pay a $500 fine, and complete 30 hours of community service." "I'm not guilty," Karen said firmly. "I wasn't drinking that night." Linda sighed. "Ms. Miller, without the dashboard camera footage and with Officer Davis's testimony about your behavior, you're facing an uphill battle. This is a good offer." "I'll take my chances in court," Karen replied. "That's your choice," Linda said. "But Judge Benson doesn't look kindly on people who waste the court's time." The courthouse was an old brick building in the center of town. Karen arrived early, wearing her best suit. Joe Phillips met her on the steps, carrying a battered briefcase. "Last chance to take the deal?" he said as they walked inside. "No," Karen said. "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do." The courtroom was smaller than Karen had expected. Wooden benches lined the back half with tables for the defense and prosecution at the front. Judge Harold Benson sat behind a high desk, looking down at everyone. He was an older man with white hair and a permanent frown. Karen and Joe sat at the defense table. Linda Hoffman was already at the prosecution table arranging her papers. The courtroom was mostly empty, except for a few people waiting for their own cases to be called. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Benson entered. Everyone stood until he took his seat. "First case," the judge announced. "Commonwealth versus Karen Miller. DUI charge." Linda Hoffman stood. "Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed." Joe stood as well. "Defense is ready, Your Honor." The judge looked at Karen with cold eyes. "How does the defendant plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Karen said clearly. Judge Benson nodded. "Very well. Ms. Hoffman, call your first witness." "The state calls Officer Frank Davis," Linda announced. Officer Davis entered from a side door. He was wearing his full uniform, polished and perfect. He walked to the witness stand with confidence, was sworn in, and took his seat. Linda guided him through his testimony. Officer Davis described seeing Karen's car swerving on the road. He claimed that when he approached her vehicle, he detected a strong odor of alcohol and observed that her speech was slurred and her eyes were bloodshot. "In my professional opinion," Officer Davis said smoothly, "Ms. Miller was intoxicated and a danger to herself and others on the road." Karen listened in disbelief. He was lying. Everything he said was a complete fabrication. She wrote a note. To Joe. "Ask about the breathalyzer and blood test results." Joe nodded slightly but did nothing as Officer Davis continued his testimony. Now the officer was claiming Karen had been combative and nearly struck another vehicle before he pulled her over. None of it was true. She showed all the classic signs of intoxication during the field sobriety test. Officer Davis told the court. Lack of balance, inability to follow simple instructions, slurred speech. Finally, Linda Hoffman finished her questions. "Your witness," she said to Joe. Joe stood slowly. "Officer Davis, the breathalyzer test at the station showed Ms. Miller's blood alcohol content at 0.01, correct?" "Yes, but field equipment can be faulty," Officer Davis replied smoothly. "That's why we did the blood test." "And the blood test also showed no significant alcohol in her system, correct?" Joe continued. "Correct, but that was taken hours after the arrest. Alcohol metabolizes in the system," Officer Davis countered. Joe seemed to deflate. "No further questions, Your Honor." Karen wrote another note, listing specific questions about the corrupted dashboard camera footage and the officer's body camera. She pushed it toward Joe, but he placed his legal pad over it, ignoring her completely. During a brief recess, Karen stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. She felt defeated and angry. Through an open door, she heard Officer Davis talking to another police officer. "Another entitled princess going down," he said with a laugh. These cases are like shooting fish in a barrel. The other officer chuckled. How many this month? This makes 5, Davis replied. The chief will be happy. The town needs the revenue from the fines. Karen froze, listening carefully. They were talking about false arrests as if they were a game, a way to meet quotas or generate money for the town. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made her blood boil. Back in the courtroom, Karen made a decision. As Joe fumbled through his closing statement, barely making an effort to defend her, she wrote a phone number on a small piece of paper. Below it, she wrote, "Call this number immediately. Tell them Karen Miller, NSA Clearance Level 4, needs assistance. Reference, Code Alpha 7 Delta." When court resumed after lunch, Karen noticed subtle changes in the room. A tall man in a dark blue suit had slipped into the back row. He sat perfectly still, watching everything with sharp eyes. The court clerk kept glancing at Judge Benson, who seemed distracted. Joe Phillips returned to the defense table looking confused. "I made that call," he whispered to Karen. "Who exactly did I just talk to?" "You'll see," Karen replied quietly. "Just follow their instructions when they arrive." Judge Benson cleared his throat. "We'll continue with the case of Commonwealth versus Karen Miller. Ms. Hoffman, are you prepared to make your closing statement?" Linda Hoffman stood up, straightening her jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. The state has clearly demonstrated." The courtroom door opened and 2 people walked in. A man and a woman, both wearing expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases. The woman handed a note to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Benson. The judge read it, and his face changed from annoyed to concerned. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Benson announced suddenly. "Ms. Miller, your new legal representatives would like to speak with you." Karen watched as confusion spread across Linda Hoffman's face. Joe Phillips looked equally surprised. The judge left quickly, not meeting anyone's eyes. The man and woman approached Karen. "Ms. Miller, I'm Paul Bennett, and this is Susan Garcia," the man said. His voice was low and confident. "We need to speak with you privately." They moved to a small conference room off the main hallway. Once the door closed, Paul Bennett's professional smile disappeared. "NSA headquarters confirmed your identity and situation," he said. "They've authorized us to intervene. This case is now a matter of federal interest." Susan Garcia opened her briefcase and pulled out several folders. "We've been working since..." "Your attorney's call. We've already found some very interesting connections between Officer Davis, Judge Benson, and the local towing company." Karen felt relief wash over her. For weeks she had followed rules and protocols. She had trusted the system, but the system had failed her. Now she was fighting back with the full weight of her position. "What happens next?" Karen asked. "We return to court," Paul explained. "We request permission to present new evidence. Then we begin dismantling Officer Davis's credibility and exposing the corruption in this courthouse." Susan handed Karen a document. "This is an official statement from your NSA supervisor confirming your position and character. We'll be introducing it when we return." The 3 of them walked back into the courtroom together. Joe Phillips looked lost, but he moved aside to make room for Paul and Susan at the defense table. Linda Hoffman was watching them with narrowed eyes. When Judge Benson returned, his face was tight with stress. "I understand there are new attorneys joining the defense," he said. "Please introduce yourselves for the record." Paul stood. "Paul Bennett, Your Honor, representing Ms. Miller. This is my colleague, Susan Garcia. We'd like to request permission to present new evidence in this case." Linda Hoffman jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution hasn't been given any notice of new evidence. The evidence was only discovered this morning," Susan replied smoothly. "It directly relates to Officer Davis's testimony and his credibility as a witness." Judge Benson looked uncomfortable. "What is the nature of this evidence?" "Phone records showing contact between Officer Davis and Timothy Benson, owner of Benson's Towing and Impound," Paul said, "as well as maintenance records for the breathalyzer equipment used in the police department." The judge's face paled slightly. Timothy Benson was his brother-in-law. Karen could see that Paul knew this already. Additionally, Susan added, "We have information regarding Ms. Miller's employment that bears directly on matters of credibility." The courtroom was silent. Judge Benson seemed to be thinking quickly. "Very well," he said finally. "The court will allow this evidence." Paul nodded to Susan, who handed documents to the judge, the prosecutor, and placed one in front of Karen. Then Paul stood to address the court. "Your Honor, Ms. Miller is not just any government employee. She is a senior analyst with the National Security Agency. Her work involves matters of national security at the highest levels. She holds a security clearance that requires the most thorough background check our government conducts." Karen watched as Officer Davis shifted in his seat. He was no longer smiling. "Ms. Miller has never had a substance abuse problem," Paul continued. "She has regular screenings as part of her security clearance requirements. The idea that she would risk her career by driving while intoxicated is not just unlikely. It's absurd." Susan stood next. "We'd like to call Dr. Alan Murray to the stand." A middle-aged man with glasses entered the courtroom. He was sworn in and took his seat at the witness stand. "Dr. Murray, please tell the court about your position," Susan requested. "I'm the head of technical analysis at the FBI's Digital Forensics Division," Dr. Murray said. "And you've examined the police dashboard. Camera footage from the night of Ms. Miller's arrest?" Susan asked. "Yes," Dr. Murray replied. "The file was reported as corrupted, but our analysis shows that the corruption was not accidental. The file was deliberately altered." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Linda Hoffman looked shocked. "Furthermore," Dr. Murray continued, "we were able to recover portions of the original footage." Susan handed him a laptop. "Please show the court what you found." Dr. Murray connected the laptop to the courtroom's display screen. The video showed Karen's traffic stop from Officer Davis's dashboard camera. The audio was clear. "I don't smell any alcohol," Officer Davis could be heard saying into his radio before approaching Karen's car. "But the chief wants more DUI arrests this month. This one looks easy." Karen watched Judge Benson's face as he viewed the footage. His expression had moved from concern to alarm. When the video ended, the courtroom was completely silent. Then Paul stood again. "Your Honor, we have more evidence to present." Phone records showing regular contact between Officer Davis and Timothy Benson, owner of the towing company that impounded Ms. Miller's car. Maintenance records showing the breathalyzer used in the police station had been flagged for calibration. Issues 3 weeks before Ms. Miller's arrest. Paul placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. "We also have statements from 7 other drivers who report similar experiences with Officer Davis. False DUI charges, all dismissed when challenged, but most people don't challenge them. They take the plea deals, pay the fines, and Timothy, Benson's towing company, collects the impound fees." Judge Benson looked at the folder as if it might bite him. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning while I review this evidence." As people began to leave the courtroom, Karen noticed Officer Davis trying to slip out a side door. Paul Bennett nodded to the man in the dark blue suit who had been sitting in the back row. The man stood and moved quickly to block Officer Davis's exit. "Frank Davis?" the man said, showing a badge. "FBI. We'd like to ask you some questions about your arrest procedures." Officer Davis's face turned white. He looked around the room, perhaps searching for help, but found none. Karen walked out of the courtroom with her new attorneys. In the hallway, reporters had already gathered. Word had spread quickly that something unusual was happening in Judge Benson's courtroom. "Ms. Miller, can you comment on what's happening with your case?" one reporter called out. Paul Bennett stepped forward. "My client was wrongfully arrested as part of a systematic scheme to generate revenue through false DUI charges. We are cooperating with federal authorities who are now investigating this matter. That's all we can say at this time." They pushed through the crowd to a waiting car. Once inside, Karen finally allowed herself to relax. "Is it over?" she asked. "The DUI charge?" "Yes," Susan said. "It will be dismissed tomorrow. But the larger investigation is just beginning. The FBI is very interested in this scheme Officer Davis and others have been running." "And Judge Benson's connection to the towing company?" Karen asked. That's being investigated too, Paul confirmed. His brother-in-law's company has made hundreds of thousands of dollars from impound fees over the past 3 years. Most of those impounds came from Davis's arrests. Karen looked out the car window as they drove away from the courthouse. She thought about all the people who hadn't been able to fight back the way she had. People without NSA credentials or connections to federal authorities. People who had paid fines they couldn't afford for crimes they didn't commit. What happens to Officer Davis now? She asked. He'll be suspended while the investigation continues, Susan explained. If the evidence holds up, he'll face serious charges. Falsifying police reports, evidence tampering, civil rights violations. Karen nodded slowly. And the others who were falsely arrested? Paul smiled slightly. That's where you come in. The FBI wants your help identifying other victims. Your analytical skills would be valuable to their investigation. For the first time in weeks, Karen felt a sense of purpose returning. She had been treated unjustly, but she had the power to help others who had faced the same injustice. I'll help, she said firmly. No one should go through what I did. As the car carried them away from the courthouse, Karen knew that her ordeal wasn't completely over. There would be more questions, more investigations. Her name would be in the newspapers again, but this time as someone who helped expose corruption. The next morning, news vans lined the street outside the courthouse. Reporters stood with microphones waiting eagerly for anyone connected to the case. Karen arrived with Paul Bennett and Susan Garcia in a black government car with tinted windows. Ready? Paul asked as they pulled up. Karen nodded. She wore a simple blue suit and carried herself with quiet confidence. She was no longer afraid. They walked up the courthouse steps, ignoring the questions shouted by reporters. Inside, the courtroom was packed. People who had heard about the dramatic events yesterday had come to see what would happen next. Karen spotted her neighbor Betty Walsh sitting in the back row looking nervous. At exactly 9 o'clock, Judge Benson entered. His face was gray and tired, as if he hadn't slept. Gone was his usual stern confidence. He sat down and cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence presented yesterday, this court has made a decision. His voice was flat. The case against Karen Miller is dismissed. All charges are dropped. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Karen felt a wave of relief, but Paul touched her arm gently, indicating there was more to come. Furthermore, Judge Benson continued, I am recusing myself from any further proceedings related to this matter due to a potential conflict of interest. I have also submitted a request for a judicial review of my previous cases involving Officer Frank Davis. Linda Hoffman stood up. Your Honor, the District Attorney's Office would like to state for the record that we had no knowledge of any improper conduct by Officer Davis or any connection to the towing company. We will be conducting our own internal review of all DUI cases from the past 3 years. Judge Benson nodded stiffly. This court is adjourned. As people began to file out, a woman approached Karen. She was in her early 40s with curly brown hair. Ms. Miller, I'm Donna Lee. Officer Davis arrested me for DUI 6 months ago. I lost my job because of it. I wasn't drinking either, but I couldn't afford to fight it. Before Karen could respond, another person stepped forward. Me too. I'm Steve Rogers. He got me last year. I had to pay $1,000 in fines plus the towing fees. Suddenly, Karen was surrounded by people, all with similar stories. Paul and Susan exchanged glances. This was bigger than they had imagined. Paul raised his hands. If anyone has experienced a similar situation with Officer Davis, please give your contact information to Ms. Garcia. The FBI is opening an investigation, and your testimony could be valuable. An hour later, Karen sat in a conference room at the local FBI field office. The table was covered with files, all DUI cases involving Officer Frank Davis over the past 3 years. Special Agent Mike Brown led the meeting. We've identified a pattern, Agent Brown explained, pointing to a chart on the wall. Davis made an average of 15 DUI arrests per month. That's 3 times the department average. Of those arrests, 80% ended in guilty pleas with fines averaging $800, and every single vehicle was towed by Benson's Towing and impound. Karen studied the data. What about the breathalyzer results? Were they all like mine, showing little or no alcohol? Agent Brown nodded. Many were. The records show multiple instances where the blood alcohol content was well below the legal limit. But the arrests proceeded anyway. The maintenance logs for the equipment were routinely falsified to explain away the low readings. Susan pulled out her own notes. And we've confirmed regular payments from Timothy Benson to Judge Harold Benson. They were disguised as loans or gifts, but the timing coincides with spikes in DUI cases in his court. The whole system was corrupt, Karen said quietly. Yes, Agent Brown agreed. But it might have continued for years if you hadn't fought back. Most people don't have the resources or connections you do. Karen thought about the people she had met outside the courtroom. People who had lost jobs, paid fines they couldn't afford, all because they were targeted by a corrupt officer looking to meet quotas and generate revenue. What happens now? She asked. We continue gathering evidence, Agent Brown explained. Officer Davis has been suspended. Judge Benson will likely face an ethics investigation, possibly criminal charges. The police chief is being questioned about his knowledge of the quota system. Paul leaned forward. And this is where you can help, Karen. Your analytical skills would be valuable in processing all this data and identifying patterns we might miss. Karen looked at the stacks of files. Each one represented a person whose life had been disrupted by this scheme. I'll help in any way I can, but I need to make sure my job at the NSA is secure first. Already taken care of, Susan said with a smile. Your supervisor, Greg Scott, received a call from the FBI director this morning. Not only is your security clearance intact, but you've been granted temporary leave to assist with this investigation if you choose to accept. That afternoon, Karen returned to her office at the NSA to collect some personal items. Her coworkers watched her with new respect as she walked through the building. Greg Scott met her at her desk. Karen, I owe you an apology, he said, looking genuinely remorseful. I should have trusted you more. You were following protocol, Karen replied. I understand. Greg shook his head. Still, I'm sorry. And I'm impressed by how you handled the situation. The director himself called me about you this morning. Karen packed her laptop and some files. I'll be back in a few weeks. The FBI needs help analyzing data for their investigation. Take all the time you need, Greg assured her. Your position will be waiting for you. As Karen drove home, she noticed her neighbors were outside, watching her curiously. Betty Walsh stood on her porch looking uncertain. Karen parked her car and walked directly to Betty's house. Betty, do you have a minute to talk? Karen asked. Betty looked embarrassed. Karen, I'm so sorry. I saw the news. I should never have believed those charges. It's okay, Karen said. Most people would have reacted the same way. I had no idea you worked for the NSA, Betty said with wide eyes. That must be so exciting. Karen smiled slightly. Most days it's just analyzing data on a computer, but sometimes, like now, I get to use those skills to help people directly. That evening, Karen sat at her dining room table. Spread before her were the stories of dozens of people who had been caught in Officer Davis's scheme. She read each, one carefully looking for patterns, connections, anything that might strengthen the case against the corrupt officials. Her phone rang. It was Paul Bennett. Karen, turn on the local news, he said urgently. Karen grabbed her remote and switched on the television. The news anchor was speaking solemnly. Breaking news tonight as the FBI has announced a major investigation into corruption in our local police department and courthouse. At the center of the scandal is Officer Frank Davis, who allegedly falsified DUI arrests to generate revenue for the town and a local towing company owned by the brother-in-law of Judge Harold Benson. The FBI credits NSA analyst Karen Miller with helping to expose the corruption after she was wrongfully arrested. The screen showed a photo of Karen, along with Officer Davis and Judge Benson. Karen felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, but also discomfort at being in the spotlight. They mentioned the NSA, Karen said to Paul. Is that a problem? No, Paul assured her. Your role as an analyst is public information. The nature of your work remains classified. This is just acknowledging your position, which gives credibility to the case." After they hung up, Karen continued reading the files. One caught her attention. A young mother who had lost custody of her children after a false DUI arrest. The woman had been unable to afford a lawyer and had taken a plea deal, not understanding the consequences it would have for her family. Karen made a note to follow up on this case personally. This was why she had joined the NSA in the first place, to protect people. Usually that meant analyzing data to identify threats to national security. But now she was using those same skills to protect people from threats much closer to home. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Susan Garcia. "Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. FBI office. More victims coming forward. This is getting bigger." Karen replied that she would be there. She gathered the files and put them in her secure briefcase. Tomorrow would be another long day, but for the first time since her arrest she felt energized rather than drained. The system that had failed her was being exposed. The people who had abused their power were facing consequences, and she was, using her position to help others who hadn't been as fortunate as she was. Sometimes, Karen thought, you had to reveal who you really were to make a difference. Her NSA credentials had not just saved her, they were now helping to save others. 3 weeks after Karen's case was dismissed, the small courthouse was transformed. News trucks from national networks filled the parking lot. Reporters from major papers crowded the steps. What had begun as a local corruption case had grown into a national story about justice and abuse of power. Karen arrived early, slipping in through a side entrance to avoid the cameras. Today was the final hearing in the case against Officer Frank Davis, Judge Harold Benson, Police Chief William Carter, and Timothy Benson, owner of the towing company. Inside a conference room, Karen met with Paul Bennett, Susan Garcia, and FBI Special Agent Mike Brown. The table was covered with evidence they had gathered together over the past weeks. "Are you ready for this?" Agent Brown asked Karen. She nodded. Her role in exposing the corruption had made her a key witness. Today she would testify about her experience and the pattern of abuse they had uncovered. "The courtroom is packed," Paul warned. "This case has caught national attention. Every seat is filled." "I'm ready," Karen said firmly. "These people hurt a lot of innocent citizens. They need to be held accountable." At 10 o'clock, they entered the main courtroom. A new Judge Mary Ann Powell from the neighboring county presided. She was known for her fairness and strict adherence to the law. Karen took her seat in the front row. Across the aisle, Officer Davis sat with his attorney. He looked smaller somehow without his uniform and badge. Judge Harold Benson was there, too, staring straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The police chief and Timothy Benson completed the group of defendants. Judge Powell called the court to order. "This hearing will determine the final charges and sentencing recommendations in the case of systematic corruption within the local justice system. We will hear final testimony, and then I will deliver my ruling." The state attorney general had taken over the case. She stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the state has presented overwhelming evidence of a criminal conspiracy that targeted innocent citizens for profit. Over a 3-year period, these 4 defendants worked together to falsely arrest and convict drivers of DUI offenses they did not commit." Karen listened as the Attorney General summarized the evidence they had gathered. The numbers were shocking. Over 300 false DUI arrests, nearly $250,000 in fines collected by the town, over $500,000 in towing and impound fees paid to Timothy Benson's company, kickbacks to Judge Benson and Police Chief Carter, lives ruined by criminal records for crimes that were never committed. "The state calls Karen Miller to the stand," the Attorney General announced. Karen walked to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she sat down and faced the crowded courtroom. "Ms. Miller, please tell the court about your experience on the night of your arrest," the Attorney General requested. Karen spoke clearly and calmly. She described the traffic stop, Officer Davis's false claims, the humiliation of the field sobriety test in the rain. She explained how her breathalyzer and blood tests showed no alcohol, yet she was still charged. She detailed the pressure to accept a plea deal despite her innocence. What made your case different from the hundreds of others? The Attorney General asked. I had resources others didn't have. Karen answered honestly. Through my position at the National Security Agency, I had access to people who could help me fight back. Most people don't have those connections. And what did your investigation reveal about this scheme? Karen looked directly at the 4 defendants as she answered. We found a systematic effort to target drivers for false DUI arrests. Officer Davis would pull people over for minor infractions or no reason at all. He would claim to smell alcohol or observe signs of intoxication even when none existed. The cars would be towed by Timothy Benson's company, generating large fees. Cases would go before Judge Benson, who would push defendants to accept plea deals rather than fight the charges. The fines would go to the town, where Police Chief Carter had implemented a quota system rewarding officers for DUI arrests. The defense attorneys had their chance to question Karen, but her testimony was solid. The evidence she had helped analyze was irrefutable. After Karen, several other victims testified. A single mother who lost her nursing job because of a false DUI conviction, a college student whose scholarship was revoked, an elderly man who could no longer drive to see his grandchildren after his license was suspended. By late afternoon, all testimony was complete. Judge Powell looked at the defendants before speaking. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant abuse of power and public trust, she said. The evidence in this case shows not just individual wrongdoing, but a conspiracy that corrupted our entire justice system. She turned to Officer Frank Davis. Mr. Davis, you used your badge to terrorize innocent citizens rather than protect them. You are found guilty of filing false police reports, evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. I sentence you to 8 years in prison. Next, she addressed Judge Harold Benson. As a judge, you took an oath to uphold justice. Instead, you perverted it for personal gain. You are found guilty of judicial misconduct, accepting bribes, and conspiracy. I sentence you to 10 years in prison and permanent disbarment. Police Chief Carter received 6 years for implementing the quota system and covering up complaints against Davis. Timothy Benson got 5 years for his role in the scheme and was ordered to pay restitution to all victims whose cars had been towed. Furthermore, Judge Powell continued, all DUI convictions involving Officer Davis over the past 3 years are hereby vacated. All fines will be refunded. All victims will have their records expunged. The town will establish a fund to compensate those who suffered job loss or other damages as a result of these false convictions. As the defendants were led away, Karen felt a profound sense of closure. Justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded her. A journalist from a national news network thrust a microphone toward her. Ms. Miller, how does it feel to have exposed this corruption? Karen thought carefully before answering. This case was never just about me. It was about all the people who didn't have the resources to fight back. It was about making our justice system work for everyone, not just those with power and connections. Another reporter asked, will you be returning to your job at the NSA now? Yes, Karen replied. But this experience has changed me. I've seen how systems designed to protect people can be twisted to harm them instead. I'll be taking that awareness back to my work. That evening, Karen walked up the path to her house. Her neighbor Betty Walsh was watering flowers in her front yard. She waved when she saw Karen. We all watched you on the news, Betty called out. The whole neighborhood is proud of you. Karen smiled and waved back. The past few months had been difficult, but something good had come from her ordeal. Not just justice for herself, but for hundreds of others. Inside her house, Karen found a letter that had been slipped under her door. It was from Mary Jackson, the young mother who had lost custody of her children after a false DUI arrest. The letter thanked Karen for her help. With her record now expunged, Mary was getting her children back. She was also starting a support group for other victims of the corrupt system. Karen's phone rang. It was her supervisor at the NSA. Karen, we're looking forward to having you back next week, Greg said. And there's something else. The director wants to meet with you. There's a new task force being formed to examine abuses of power in law enforcement databases. They think your experience would be valuable. I'd be interested in that, Karen replied, thinking of all the people she had met during the investigation. After they hung up, Karen sat on her couch and reflected on everything that had happened. A simple traffic stop had exposed corruption. That had hurt hundreds of people. Her NSA credentials had given her the power to fight back when others couldn't. She thought about Officer Davis laughing at her in the rain that night, not knowing who she really was. She thought about Judge Benson's face when her true identity was revealed. She thought about all the victims who had come forward once they knew they weren't alone. Sometimes justice needed a push. Sometimes systems needed to be challenged. And sometimes revealing your true self was the most powerful thing you could do. Karen Miller, NSA analyst, had learned this lesson well, and she would carry it with her as she returned to her work, now with a deeper understanding of the power of truth and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves.